kings and their kingdoms, and also about the prophets. Make us to hear properly and understand and follow your commandments. Bless everyone who is here to hear your words. Fill our hearts and open our inner eye so that we accept everything what you say. Bless the pastor, and as he is proceeding to give us the word, be with him and prepare everything what you desire for us to learn. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.
Thank you, Auntie. Thank you for that prayer. So, just a quick recollection of what we have been doing last week. Yeah, I'm just going to share. Since last we began, this is part 5 of the Bible series that we've been doing. So, part 5 is about Samuel. So, we're going to do about Samuel, and last week, Samuel 1. That was our topic last week. So, I'm just going to share quickly what we went through last week, just to recap, just for a recap, and then we'll move on to today's chapter, Samuel, chapter 2, second book of Samuel. So while I'm just opening up the text for last week, the notes for last week, anything in particular that you seem to know or you want to share, you're welcome at this time. So the book of Samuel, as we know last week, was an introduction to a transition in the life of the Israelites. That is from judges to king. So we are the kings coming in, right? So it's a transition. And of course, Samuel was a prophet, and he was also a leader, and he was also more of he was seen in the line of Moses, prophet Samuel. And one thing is that in First Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29, we have not just one book, but there are 3 books mentioned. So that is the records of Samuel, the records of Nathan the prophet, and records of Gad the seer. So today we are going to see about Gad the prophet. He's going to come into David's. So he's going to be one of those who are Nathan and Gad. These are the 2 prophets we are going to see today. And Samuel is also one of. So these 3 prophets are very key in the life of Israelites when it comes to things, the transition period. So of course, we looked at how First Samuel is mostly about how Israelites wanted a king. They did not want God as their king. They wanted their own king, and that's what we see here. And God gives them a king. So we know the political disaster that followed, the spiritual disaster. So we looked at it from a spiritual point of view, where they rejected God as king, and also from a political standpoint, wherein that led to a lot of problems. We're going to see that today also. So the background of First Samuel, obviously, as we said, the transition from judges to monarchy. That's the background. And of course, the prophetic role of Samuel is very important for us. Samuel becomes God's representative, and Samuel becomes like a checkpoint for the king. He makes sure that the kings do not falter in their ways. And of course, we had the early life of Samuel, how he was called, and how his parents, how his mother dedicated him, and the meaning of Samuel. Samuel means Shamuel. That means heard by God. A prayer was heard by God. So that's the meaning. So names have a lot of importance in the Old Testament. So Samuel, mother named him after that, heard by God. So therefore, Samuel. El means God. Shama means heard. So Shamael, that means heard by God. So we also went into how the political crisis and the spiritual crisis escalated in the life of the Israelite community, and how Saul, who was chosen by God, went against God because he wanted to, in a way, try to take over the prophetic role. Saul was supposed to work under the prophets, accepting God's direction. But Saul here, he rejects the prophets, and he tries to have absolute power. So First Samuel is about how God rejected Saul because of Saul's greed for absolute power. And we note how that God is against absolute power. This dictatorship kind of a model is not biblical. So we see that here very clearly. And God rejects Samuel and appoints a shepherd boy. So David had to face a lot of problems. We see all that in First Samuel, how David was threatened by Saul and how Saul tried to kill him. All that is part of First Samuel. So First Samuel, in a way, ends with a rather difficult note. That is, it's not a very pleasant note. Samuel is disturbed. Saul is disturbed. Samuel takes the side of a shepherd boy, and here the whole country is there appreciating Saul that because of his stature. But here God says, no, it's not about that. It's only the heart. God sees the heart. So therefore, Samuel takes the side of God. It's not about the physical aspect of Saul, but the heart of David, which God wants. And so Samuel takes the side of David, and of course we see how that leads to. So today, in that context, before I proceed, anything that you would like to personally share, anyone with regard to First Samuel, you're free to do at this time, and then we'll proceed. I'll just give a couple of
I,
minutes for anyone who, yeah.
I would like to say that Saul was the first king of Israel,
Right,
and David was the second king of Israel, and they did a lot. They did fight battles and all for the Israelites.
right, right. Thank you, Neeta, for that. That's right. So we are looking at the beginning of monarchy. So the first king, and today we're going to look at the second king. So First Samuel is basically the first initial monarchy how it began, and today we're looking at the second monarch, the second king in the monarchy line. Yeah. Anything else that you'd like to share? Anyone? Would you like to add something? Honest uncle, would you like to add something? Okay. So just keeping that thought, chain of thought in our mind. So we are, if you just look at the screens, we are almost towards the end of our Bible series of journeys. First, we had the Exodus to Canaan. Then we had the conquest of Canaan, and then we had the role of the judges. Then we had the journey of Ruth. Then we have the role of Samuel. So today is part 5, continuation of the role of Samuel. Now, what is important here is that why are we actually doing a Bible series starting from Exodus and moving on to the Kings? Because of a connection. There is a particular connection that we're going to see today, and that's what Second Samuel is about. So Second Samuel, basically, if you look at it, the backdrop is about life of David. So Second Samuel is basically about David, who's the successor to King Saul, and it is also about the conflict between David and Saul, which increased to extent that David was hiding from Saul. And what happened in this context? The political situation weakened. Then now Saul, instead of taking care of the kingdom and protecting the kingdom against the Philistines, which were a constant threat, so Saul has now focused his attention on David, and so the country is weak. The kingdom is weak now. So you can see how his personal arrogance has cost the country, the nation, the empire. So Saul is now, instead of being a good king, he's more about satisfying his own ego. And the cost of his ego is that he's trying to kill David, and the cost of it is that First Samuel ends with how Philistines overtake and defeat Israel. That's how First Samuel ends. So Second Samuel begins with that situation where Saul, instead of being a good king, taking directions from the prophet, instead of doing that, instead of protecting the country, the kingdom, he becomes arrogant, he becomes absolute, he wants absolute power, and now he has even forgotten his purpose, very purpose as a king. So he has now said, no, he wants to satisfy his ego. He's not worried about Philistines coming in, attacking. So Philistines take it, this becomes a weakness for the kingdom. Philistines attack, and Saul and his sons are killed. So what happens here is, it's not just one man's ego. The ego of Saul, the want of absolute power, destroyed his life. He commits suicide actually. The First Samuel towards the end tells us that he fell on his own sword to avoid humiliation, being caught by the Philistines. He falls on his own sword and he dies. And Saul's sons are also killed. Jonathan and other sons, all of Saul's sons are killed. So it's a very sad ending actually. And all that because one man, Saul, did not want to go under the direction of the prophets. He did not want to go under the direction of God. He wanted absolute power. and he wanted to satisfy his ego by wanting to get rid of David. So one man's ego cost the country there. Yeah. So that's the situation of First Samuel when it ends. So Second Samuel takes on from there. So towards the end of Saul's reign, kingdom was in shambles. It was a very pathetic situation. Philistines had overtaken Israel, Judah. They had taken the ark also. Now the ark of the covenant was with the people of Judah, and it was a symbol of God's presence and for God's power and God's authority. Now the Philistines deliberately they targeted because they know once they take the ark away, the morale of the Israelites is gone. And sure enough, it goes. So now the ark is gone, the Philistines have overtaken, and that is the time when David becomes king. He becomes king of Judah. So he's actually not full king of whole Israel now. He's only king of Judah. And what happens also is another problem. There are other tribes who reject David as king, and they go with Solomon's son, who is one of the surviving sons of Solomon. So that is also what there's a conflict. David, when he took over the kingdom, he already had to contend not just with the Philistines, but also with the internal rebels who were rebelling against him. So there were few people who were siding one of Saul's son, and that's what we see here in this context. So this Second Samuel also around the same time, written at the same time of First Samuel, initially one book, and it is mainly talking about Nathan and Gad as the main prophets, along with Samuel. So Second Samuel is not just about Samuel alone. The Jewish chronicles and the Jewish writings and the biblical writings state that it was Samuel who wrote it. But towards the end, after Samuel's death, it was the annals of Gad and Nathan. So that's what we find in First Chronicles 29:29. And also, what is interesting is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they found parchments, found pieces of First and Second Samuel, and they were accurate to the words, accurate to the translation of the Vulgate. So that proved that what Latin translation existed is actually it is not wrong, it is right. It is from the original. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a few parchments, few pieces of First Samuel, which was found, and they were very exact to the original text in the Vulgate. And so some of the there is something known as a surviving document known as the Aleppo Codex. It was found in the 10th century. Now, Aleppo was a community. It was like the Qumran community, another community who had preserved a certain document about the pertaining to the kingly rules. And so that document contained the annals of King David and Solomon, and that existed for quite some time. So that is known as the Aleppo Codex. Similar. So the time of Second Samuel is at the time of reign of King David. That's what we see. Most scholars agree with that. So it's about 630 to 540 BC, about 600, 700 years before Christ. So the historical background of this is that the sequence of history is very important. That's why we started with the Exodus. Now, if you look at the Old Testament, the sequence of history is not just for Samuel alone. The sequence of history goes back to the Exodus. From the Exodus, the sequence comes to David. And how do we see that? Now, if you look at all the Bible studies that we've done so far, now all that leads to the king of King David, reign of David. And that is what they're trying to prove. If you look at Exodus, if you look at Ruth, if you look at Judges, everything actually comes down to King David. The connection comes to King David. How do we know that? So look at the first study that we did. The Exodus is about the promised land. So the God has given you a land. So the promised land. And then we have the conquest of the promised land. So we have leaders. And then we have the earliest settlement through the judges. And then Ruth. And of course, monarchy comes in. Now, what is interesting here is that why is Ruth brought in, even though it is linked at the time of the judges? Because as we have seen in that study of Ruth, Ruth is the grandmother of David. So to prove that David is from the lineage of the earlier lineage, to show David's lineage and to say that King David is in that same line, the whole Old Testament history is being written in that context with one mind to say that the Davidic dynasty is from God, to show that Davidic dynasty, that is God, is established by God, because in the annals of history, David's rule is considered as a golden period. So that is why so much of importance is given, and also because the messianic covenant, that your kingdom will last forever and ever. That was a covenant which was made by God to David. We're going to see that today. So mainly because of that. Because for us, the messianic covenant in the line of David, again, when we come back, it comes to Matthew, wherein the Jewish genealogy traces it back to King David. To say that in the line of King David, Jesus was born. So that is why the Davidic dynasty and the Messianic covenant is very important. And that is why the Old Testament also is very important, because it ultimately not just ends with David, but it goes on to Jesus also, who's in the line of David. So that is why when we look at the sequence of the Old Testament, this is very crucial. The line of David is very crucial. So it is, you can say, before David and after David. The Old Testament from Genesis, from the Exodus, if you look at it, it comes down to David, and from David it continues and comes to Jesus. So the period is, that's how it is divided. So Ruth also, the book of Ruth, even though David was not born at that time, we see that David is mentioned in the book of Ruth, that Ruth is David's grandmother. So that is to show the lineage of David and the importance of David. So what is the context of 2 Samuel? As I already told you before, David becomes king of the northern part, that is Israel, and northern part Israel rejects David, and Ishbosheth is the son of Saul, who was surviving, and he kind of becomes a rebel. So right from the beginning, David had enemies. So he is able to overcome them. After David becomes king of Judah, he is able to overcome. God promises him victory over Philistines first, and David brings the ark back to Jerusalem. So he establishes Jerusalem as the seat of God's power or God's presence. So Jerusalem is important not because David is the king. Jerusalem is important because of the ark, because ark is there, God's presence is there. That is why Jerusalem is the holy city, not because it is David's city, but because it is the city where the ark was brought back, the power of God or the symbol of God. So after that only we see that David is able to overcome Ishbosheth, and then consolidate the kingdom. So that happens later. We'll come to that later. So just moving on to the outline of Samuel. So David's rise as king, that's what we see in the first part. Now David, when he became king, we see that he feels sad for Saul. That Saul and Jonathan, especially his closest friend, they say Saul and David and Jonathan, they were of one heart. That's what the Bible tells. So they were very close. So now Saul and Jonathan are dead, and David laments for it. So that is recorded that he did not say, "My enemies are gone. It's good, Lord, thank you." He laments. He actually spends time in lamenting. And then, of course, he becomes king of Judah. And then, after he conquers Philistines, he brings back the ark, establishes Jerusalem as the center by placing the ark there. And Jerusalem also was not under him, it was under the Jebusites. So he conquers the Jebusites, takes over Jerusalem and establishes it. So the David as a king is established not in a day, but after he is able to bring back the symbol of God's power back. That is when his kingship is actually established. So to restore God's reign, a king is not someone like Saul who wants to have power over the king, but a true king is someone who is able to establish God's power over the people. So David is a very good king in that way. He does what Saul did not do. Saul failed because he wanted power for himself. And David, the first thing that he does is brings the power of God, the ark of God, back. So to establish God's power, to say that I'm the king, but God has power over us. So I'm under God's power. So that is a very good sign that David showed. But what happens later is that in the first part, after chapter 1 to 5, is about how David establishes himself as a king, not because of his power, but because he brings God's power, the ark, the symbol of God's power, back to Jerusalem and among the people.
What are you showing me all this, man?
Yeah, but what happens here after verse 6 to 8, and following in verse 7. So 6 to 11, we find there is a diversion in David's life. Not diversion in David's life. David's continued faithfulness to God is found from 6 to 11 also. So what happens is the ark is brought back, and David wants to further it by building a temple. Now this is very important because until then there was no temple. There was the ark was kept only in the tent. There was only a temporary tent for the God's presence, the ark. But now David says God's presence should be permanent, and that's why he wants a temple. So the temple concept is very important for us because what is a temple? It is not the seat of power of the king. It's the permanent presence of the God. So a temple, if it is not meant for God's presence, it is no longer a temple. So a temple is the permanent presence of God. It is to signify the permanent presence of God. So in a temple, if God is not worshipped, that's why we see also in Jesus Christ when there was a sale going on in the temple, when it was like a marketplace, temple was converted to a marketplace. Jesus takes a whip and cleanses the temple, because the cleansing of the temple also goes back to this purpose, wherein a temple is a place where God's presence is recognized and God's presence is accepted, and it is honored. God's presence is honored. You don't dishonor God's presence. So what we are actually looking at is not just something in the life of Israelites. See, temple concept or tabernacle concept or God's power concept, all these are very meaningful to us even today. Because if the church is a place of power of man, then it is no longer temple of God. It is no longer a church. It is a power of a person, that's all. So we'll come to that later anyway. So what David does is he wants a permanent place for the presence of God, but God promises through Nathan saying that it is not David, but it is after David. David's son will have to build the king. So that promise comes, but the Messianic covenant is very important here in chapter 7. The Messianic covenant is that David's dynasty will be established forever. Now, this is again has led to a lot of misunderstandings in the Jewish understanding, and I will come to that later in the course of the Bible study when we come to the kings, because there was something known as the Maccabean revolt in the life of the Israelites. The Maccabean revolt is the intertestamental period where the Maccabees, the dynasty of Maccabees, they claim to be the messianic fulfillers. They said that we are the Messiah, and that's what the Maccabean revolt was all about. So anyway, we'll come to that later. But what we need to understand here is that the Messianic covenant, that is the David's dynasty, that is saying that the dynasty will last forever, that was established here. But the meaning was different. It was the kingdom of God. We understand it as the kingdom of God in Jesus Christ, where God's kingdom is established forever. So that is how we look at the promise of the Messianic covenant here. And there, of course, then David goes on to fulfill God's faithfulness by being good to Jonathan. Now, this is also very important because Mephibosheth, Jonathan's dynasty, one who survived, he was a cripple, and David is very good to him. He takes him in his palace. So he shows kindness to his enemies, but not even though he is Saul's descendants. But David he is very good to them. What happens later is the downfall of David. Now, David, unlike Saul, he was not hungry for power. But we see another weakness in David. We see that he fell into adultery and committed murder. Now, murder and adultery, again, it's something that very unlikely of a king. So, what it goes to show is that when we look at 1 Samuel, people wanted a king, a human king. And now the flaws of a human being are also being shown. So when you reject God and when you want a human being there, all the flaws along with that also will come to us. So here the problem with Israelites is that they rejected God and now they wanted a human king. Now the flaws of a human king also they are going to inherit. The first was Saul. Saul's taste for power and his absolute need for power, they destroyed the kingdom literally. Philistines came and destroyed them, took away the ark. Now David, he was not hungry for power, and that was also one of his good points. But we see that he fell into adultery and murder. Of course, what he did was, we know all the story. He murdered Uriah the Hittite, and he took his wife Bathsheba. And this was condemned by the prophet Nathan. Now again, we look at prophets, the role of prophet here in 1st and 2nd Samuel is very important. Samuel corrected Saul, but Saul did not want the correction. Here, Nathan corrects David and David accepts. That is the difference here. Between Saul and David, Saul did not correct himself. To the end also, Saul was only trying to fulfill his personal ego and personal thirst for power. But David, when Prophet Nathan accuses him, you are that man who has taken, he tells him a parable, where a man takes the lamb of a poor man, even though he has many sheep. So, and then David says, who's that man? And Nathan says, you are that man. So it's a nice way of, directly condemning the king, even though he's a king. The prophets had the guts, or so to say, they had the authority to even correct the king. So king was not above correction. That's what we see here. And David accepted that. Even with all his weaknesses, David accepts his mistake. He repents, he laments, but that leads to a lot of problems in his kingdom. What happens is the subsequent chapters, up to, if you look at till chapter 24, David's sons, through his many wives, he has almost 3 wives, and through 3 of them, David has different children. And all of these children who are stepsons and stepdaughters, they have internal conflicts, and they don't go along well at all. None of the children go along well, to an extent that David's eldest son Absalom, he starts a revolt against his own father. He wants to dethrone his father and take over the kingdom. He is actually rightfully the next successor. But what happens is again, you see the kind of, he wants to get rid of, he wants to establish himself above his siblings, above his stepson, stepbrothers and sister. He tries to, he goes against, he has a rebellion. He takes other people, many people against King David, and he starts a rebellion. And unfortunately, Absalom is killed by David's commander Joab. And it doesn't end there. Now, David used a man called Joab, who's commander, to kill his own son. And of course, David laments for his own son Absalom. But Joab also, his commander who was faithful to David, later he wants to become powerful. He starts a rebellion against David. So you see the kind of problems that David faced over and over because of one mistake that he made. His mistake, his failure, his weakness again cost the kingdom. Now there is civil war within the kingdom. His own children are against him. His son is killed by David himself through his commander. His commander turns against him even till the end. And then his other children also, they have internal conflicts, to the extent that it is even abuse. One of his son, Amnon, he violates his own stepsister, Tamara. So to the extent that other brothers, they get angry, they go and kill Amnon. So you see the kind of family conflicts that was building up in David's family alone. Very, very pathetic. But towards the end, it so happens that David, the same city where he brought God's power to Jerusalem, that same city David had to leave. Not because God rejected him, but because of his internal problems. His own children were against him. Absalom was trying to take over the kingdom. David had to flee Jerusalem. He comes back to Jerusalem only after Absalom is killed. So what we find towards the end is actually where Prophet Gad, then another prophet, also comes, and Nathan is not there now. We have the third prophet Gad, whose annals are not there. It doesn't exist now. Only the mention of the prophets is there in 2 Samuel. But during the exilic period, there existed these 3 books: the annals of Gad the prophet, Nathan the prophet, and Samuel the prophet. So what is surviving? Only this. So what happens is towards the end, there is a plague which happens because of census. Now, God was against having a census. God directed the people not to have a census, but here the people of Israel make God angry. We do not know why, but it is mentioned that God is angry with the people of Israel in chapter 21 onwards, and David orders a census. And Prophet Gad comes and says that this is against God, and consequence of that, there is a plague. And Gad again tells David to build an altar for God. And after he builds an altar for God, that again becomes a symbol of putting back God's position. So what happened here is that David, again, to an extent, to some way, he had lessened the honor for God. So building an altar for God was to honor God. So somewhere down the line, the census was a show of power to say that I'm the king and these are my people. That was against God. The reason why census was not approved by God, because when a counting happens, when census happens, it is my kingdom. These are my people. These are my soldiers. It is not God's. So God didn't want that. So census violated God's authority or God's honor, and so David had to build an altar for God to restore God's honor. That's why, and after that, the plague stops. So when David honors God, the plague stops. So we see this recurring theme in the life of David. Whenever he dishonored God, there was a problem, and when he honored God, when he humbled himself before God, we see God restoring. So this is the cycle of David's life. And so the life of David, with all his weaknesses, one thing was he was not like Saul, who wanted absolute power, who wanted to control everything. No, but he had his weaknesses, and his weakness also was characterized by his humility. Now, David's character and quality is humility. Even though he was a king, he was never arrogant like Saul. When the ark was brought, David, in order to honor God, he danced before the ark. So very often this dance of David is misinterpreted to say that it was probably a show of his ability to dance or nothing. No, what we see is David. He was a player of the instrument. He was a singer, composer. He wrote many psalms. And here his dance. The dance is not something that David did to entertain people, but it was, yeah, for God. It was a way to honor God. It was not like some pop dancers what we see in today's situation. It was it was a graceful movements of the body to honor God. That's what we see here. Yeah, it was it was a lot of reverence in that. So what we see dance today, when I say the word dance, our mind will immediately go to the dances that happens in the movies and in stages. No, that is more of a cultural aspect. It is only for entertainment, and it is only for people to honor their life. But
Holy dance.
yeah, but David's dance, the dance of David, it's a wrong word, but we don't have any other word. But it was more of he was honoring God with his body. That was what we find. So David humbled himself before God. When the ark was brought, he humbled himself. When he made a mistake, when Nathan the prophet came, he humbled himself. When Gad the prophet came and told him, what you have done is wrong, he humbled himself. So right through David's life, we see he humbled himself before the word of God and before the prophets. He was willing to be guided by God. He was willing to be corrected by God. And that is why David is recognized as the greatest king of Israel. Not because he was able to unite the kingdom, not because the kingdom was consolidated by him, but because he was simply willing to humble himself before God. So we see that in the quality where he brought back the ark, established the ark, and then he builds an altar for God, honoring God. He didn't build anything for himself. So this is what we see in the life of David. So in the table that I'm just showing before you, we have David's triumphs in the first part and David's troubles in the second part, and how David's life towards the end, in a way, is kind of successful, and also there is a failure also in his part. And the failure in his part is that the kingdom is broken, and that's what we are going to see next. So Solomon takes over from David at a very crucial point, and Solomon also, in a way, is a better king. But there again, we're going to see how the weaknesses of Solomon are also going to be there. So King Saul had his weakness, but he also had his strength. King David also had his weakness, but he also had his strength. And that's what we're going to see in Solomon and other kings also. But what happens is, as the king successors come, the strengths become less and the weaknesses will become more. That's what we are going to see. So David is considered as the greatest of kings because he was able to unify the kingdom. He was able to restore God's power in the people. He said, it's not my power, it is God's power. And that is very important for a king. For a king to say that it is not my power, but God's power. because that was the failure of Saul. So throughout history, David is accepted as the greatest of the kings not because he was the greatest king, but because he humbled himself before God. When Samuel corrected him, he accepted. When Nathan corrected, he accepted. When Gad corrected him also, he accepted. So that is the greatness of King David. So I'm going to stop here and allow you all to respond to anything or any doubts, any questions. So we need to remember the Messianic covenant. Chapter 7 is very important because the Messianic covenant is a connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and Jesus in the line of King David. So the Davidic dynasty doesn't mean that David's successors will forever be the rulers of Israel. No, the Davidic dynasty, or the promise of the everlasting Davidic dynasty, is that God will bring up another king in the line of King David who will establish the kingdom over all the earth. That is the meaning here. Of course, the people, they misunderstood that. That we are going to look at it later when we do the kings and the kingdoms. So any doubts that you have in this, you can please raise it now, and we will go ahead with that. Anything that you would like to add also, you may please do so.
King
Yeah.
Saul helped. Was a pioneer